Good morning, everyone, here and out there. The first time I met Henry Logan was at a Christmas party around 2013 or 14 at our son Cooper's house here in Gainesville. By an interesting set of circumstances, our son and daughter-in-law, Cooper and my, Dean, had bought the Logan's house in the duck pond and had continued the Logan's tradition of having a traditional holiday party at each holiday season. Later, of course, Robert and I got to know Henry and Nelson as residents of Oak Hammock. In fact, when we were exploring CCRCs, Robert called Henry with several questions and of course got very good answers. But then Henry broke off the questioning and stated flatly and enthusiastically, "Robert, it's about the people, and it's all about the people." And she was right. So here we are, and without further ado, here is introducing Henry Logan, and the topic of her adventure in living is When All Else Fails, Try Bran Muffins.
Thank you, Deb, for that very nice introduction. I have to say, when I was first approached to do this, my heart beat madly, like, why and how can I possibly do anything like this? And yet, like John said, and many others have said, the value of a little bit of introspection. Let's see if we can get this to advance. A little bit of introspection is wonderful. And as I prepared for this, I realized what an unbelievably lucky woman I have been for the adventures, the people I have known, and the activities and the people that I have loved and have been loved by. I want to set the context just a little bit. I am the granddaughter of a woman with a 5th grade education who was widowed by an automobile accident when she was in her 40s and left with 3 children at home. The year is 1939. And here is Hutchinson, Kansas, in the heartland. And that is where I was born. I was born to a woman with a college degree who described a college degree as an insurance policy. I was the daughter of a football and basketball coach. And I loved to dress up. I remember fun and laughter and basketball and football, and most of all, cheerleaders. The cheerleaders would sometimes come up where I was sitting at the basketball or football games. They were beautiful and they were full of fun and they talked to me. And so cheerleaders were a very important part of my life. My father had served on the battleship Arizona. And I think world politics and what was going on was always part of the conversation in my home. And as the storm clouds of World War II were building, and the context in which this war was going to be fought were always, even as a little kid, I remember this conversation. But I also remember that during this time, the fun and laughter and cheerleaders began to fade in the background, and we loaded everything that we had in a pickup truck and moved to the family farm. At this time, just a little bit more, about 50% of everyone lived on farms or in rural areas. So moving to the family farm was not such an unusual circumstance. And also, the United States was desperate to stay neutral in that European conflict, if you remember. So these were the contexts that I had to leave my cheerleaders behind. But what does a little girl do? The cheerleaders met the gravel road. And I named the family cows after the cheerleaders. I don't know how they felt about it, but it was very comforting. This is my dear Claudia, the black and white Swiss, or black and white Holstein. Here she is. She walked around on high heels all the time, you know, the way the hoofs were. And then here's, let's go back here. And here is Jane and Betty. One was a brown Swiss and one was a Jersey cow. And so whenever I got particularly lonely, I could go out to the cattle lot and I could see my cheerleaders in the form of the cows. My parents were very amused by my enamorment with the cheerleaders. But not too long after that, my baby brother was born. And I can tell you that life changes a lot for an only child when a baby brother. And I want you to take a look at this man's face, how it has changed from those days when he was a football coach and a basketball coach. And now we were living on the family farm, and our job was to raise food because that was an important part of the war effort. This is my brother and me, and he's sitting quietly in this picture, but that was not the common experience at our household. Farm life. Well, there were some things that were positive about farm life. There was the tractor, which was always noisy, but if you got to ride on it, that was a lot of fun. But there was a haymow up there, and you could always find baby kittens in the haymow, no matter what. There were cousins, there were kitties, there were puppies, there were bicycles. So there were a lot of things that were almost compensatory for having to give up my cheerleaders. Then there was school. School was an interesting experience for a kid on a farm on a gravel road because, you know, there's no kindergarten in those days. And you go straight to school. It was a rural school. And there were all those rules. Don't get out of your seat without permission. How do you get permission? Calmly raising your hand and waiting to be recognized. But what if you were sick? What if you were sick to your stomach? What if you, and how furious people were when you threw up in your seat because you knew you were not supposed to get out of your seat. It created a very interesting relationship with rules. And what I learned is that rules are subject to interpretation, and you jolly well better figure out who's doing the interpreting if you're going to be successful. There were some really pivotal moments in that elementary school education on that gravel road in that teeny tiny little town. And I was, as about a fifth grader, asked to write the editorial for the school paper. I wasn't the editor of the paper, but I was to write this editorial. So my teacher and I sat down and we talked a lot about goal setting. And he suggested, well, why don't you write something about goals? And so I wrote, and I still have this little editorial, although I couldn't find it for today's presentation. And it was about goals and aiming high, aspirational goals, and never giving up, being persistent in the pursuit of these goals, and always aim higher than you think you can accomplish. And in this elementary school, we got the first set of encyclopedias. And I remember the S encyclopedia. And this is for you, John, because that was stars. And I could go look up stars and talk about aiming high and thinking about the cosmos. So that was a very important moment in my elementary education. There was a second pivotal moment in these early years, and that was the only family vacation we ever took. We drove from our farm to St. Louis, Missouri, and I had the chance to see my first baseball game. And it was truly a memorable. First of all, the drive in those days from the Kansas-Oklahoma border to St. Louis, Missouri was something else. And we arrived late, of course, because it took much longer than I think we had anticipated. We got our seats, whatever we could get. We packed into the stadium. And in that stadium, I had a chance to see Jackie Robinson play. This was the old Sportsman Park. But the most important thing that I remember from that is this stadium was filled with people of color. I had not known a lot of people of color. And the other thing that was amazing is here I arrive as a St. Louis Cardinal fan. Stan Musial hits a home run and the crowd is hushed. And I learned that this crowd was all for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And Jackie Robinson played, and Duke Snyder, remember, he was the center fielder. I remember him dive and make a sensational catch out in center field. Preacher Rowe pitched, and I can't remember for sure whether Don Newcomb pitched or not, but I know that Ralph Branca pitched on that day, because these are names that were just absolutely imprinted. So the love of baseball began very early for me, but also an understanding of something about social justice, because you couldn't see Jackie Robinson play in St. Louis, Missouri, in a stadium filled with people of color cheering madly and not go, what is this about? So here again, my dad and I talked a little bit about breaking the color lines and things such as that. So it was not only an incredible experience in seeing these players, but it was also a real eye-opening experience for this kid on the gravel road coming from central Kansas. But it also was much to ponder about baseball. I had a bulletin board, as most young girls that age did. My bulletin board was not covered with movie stars. It was covered with baseball players and batting averages. And I remember on one occasion, Eddie Stanky had taken over as manager of the St. Louis Cardinals. And I had torn his picture off of the cover of Sports Illustrated, and it was up on my bulletin board. And I had found a 4-leaf clover, and I had put it up there and made a big sign that said, "Good luck, Eddie." And my dad walked in. He said, "He's going to need it." And of course, he did. He wasn't very long in that position because they didn't do very well. Well, then it's high school. It's 10 miles to the high school that I went to. And how did you get there in those days? You drove. I drove all by myself, 10 miles, often in our pickup truck to the high school. And sometimes my parents would let me use the car. And every single day, I went to this rural school 10 miles away. By this time, only about 20% of the American public is living on the farms. So we're becoming much more of an anomaly, and that figures into the rest of my story. The prevailing mood was that girls didn't need math and science, and if it was hard, why bother? Because girls don't need it. And there was a tendency to counsel us out of math and science and do other things. I balked at shorthand. No way was I going to take shorthand. But there was a pivotal moment in that first year in high school. And even though my father and mother could see no reason that I took math and science, I was offered a chance to join the varsity debate squad as a freshman. And my dad leaped at that because he said, there's nothing better than being able to stand up at the front of a group and give a talk, even if your heart is pounding. And so I joined the varsity debate squad as a 14-year-old. And on that squad were 3 senior boys. The debate coach was a man. And I guess I got comfortable with hanging out with largely male groups. And I also got fairly comfortable with standing up for myself and not being too intimidated by their opinions, which turned out to be useful, except I had to always be careful when I followed them around that I didn't follow them into the men's room instead of going to the ladies' room, because there was never a line at the ladies' room in those days. The topic of debate that year, I think, is pretty interesting. Resolved that the President of the United States should be elected by direct vote of the people. In other words, we were debating the Electoral College at that time. I learned enormous amounts, even though I had to have a lot of help writing my speeches. I learned that issues are never black and white, that you can always find a better argument for a good argument. And so this was an important, I guess, arrangement of how I think about things, and particularly in conversations. And I learned that there were just many, many, many sides. And if you could be articulate and talk about something, you could probably win the debate. So those debate topics, I think, are fascinating, and I will say some more about that in a few minutes. So I think I would say that my high school experience was pretty much atypical. This is one of the debate squads. I had boyfriends and graduation, was basketball queen, all those kinds of usual circumstances that went along in rural high schools in that day. But one event I think is worth noting here. When I was in my senior year, and the debate topic was resolved that the federal government should sustain the price of major agricultural products at no less than 90% of parity. The percentage of people living on the farm at that time had really plummeted. And so there was great conversation about the value of subsidizing farms. But you remember also at that time, wheat and corn were being used as weapons, and we would also often have tariffs, and we would also have embargoes and things like that. So this was an important topic. And even after Sputnik, I remember there was much conversation about the need for math and science, but what about food security? It's been a topic for a very long time. And just as a further aside, when one of our sons finished his MBA, his final project, his final small group project was, shall we subsidize agriculture? So 40 years later. So these topics that I was exposed to, even though it was a gravel road, were really important and have remained important in the world. And I don't see it going away anytime soon. So after high school, it's off to college I go. And I was the only girl in the class, of course, to go off to college. But going to college was an absolute foregone conclusion. In 1958, Sputnik, and that changed very much the orientation. And I found college a very conflicted time. I had learned that a college education was an insurance policy. There was never any conversation about career aspirations There was just getting the college degree. And there again, I found the rules were subject to interpretation. And it depended a little bit on who it was that was doing the interpreting. So the best thing about my college was I met my beloved husband. And this is that kid brother. And I can tell you, he fell in love with Nelson even more than I did. And he idolized him. Nelson was a college football player. So you see that I was drawing the circle together. My greatest happiness had been sitting in the stands of football and basketball games. Nelson wore number 20, and this is actually from Wichita State's football team. I was lucky enough to find it as I dug out there on the internet. So we married after we had both graduated. I think I love this picture of my dad and me, and this is as part of our wedding party. My brother had pitched 9 innings of baseball that morning of the wedding, and he promptly passed out at the wedding, so made for an eventful, so he's not in that picture, but that's okay. We got married nonetheless, and we got married in this historic Presbyterian church in Freeport, Kansas, that had a population at its greatest of 100 when the Cherokee Strip opened. And at this time, Nelson and I were calculating there were about 15 people that lived in the town, and we knew them all quite well. Thank you very much. The fun thing about this picture is that my uncle was a Presbyterian minister, and he married my parents. He was the first, they were his first wedding in this church, and Nelson and I were his last in this church. So you can see the knot was tied pretty tight. There wasn't much chance that that was going to be undone. So after college, we loaded everything up and moved to Salt Lake City. Nelson was there to pursue a degree, a PhD in computer science. Wow, was that new, revolutionary, cutting edge stuff. And I taught school. Those were incredibly heady times. And so the adventure begins. As Nelson began his PhD in computer science, and I was teaching in the public schools, I had another really pivotal moment in my life. I was selected as a teacher, I'm an elementary school teacher, to train in the NSF math program because they wanted to upgrade the quality of math education in the elementary schools. And I had been counseled out of math and science, and I went, wow, these are the most exciting concepts I had ever heard of. And I fell in love with math. And it was a true turning point in my life. And I think John Axe made the comment in his that the NSF programs at that time transformed a lot of people's lives. I don't know whether I was a better school teacher because of it, but I can tell you it changed my absolute orientation to what happened after that. And during, I'm going to go back and stay on this for just a second because I want to say that during Nelson's PhD training in computer science, which was a brand new field, they often invited me to come to their seminars. And I was so honored. I mean, in retrospect, it seemed pretty normal at the time because here I had come out of this NSF math training program and was just in love with math concepts. And they were in the early stages of machine learning. And they were so interested in how kids learn. And since I was teaching kids math, they wanted to always pick my brain and talk to me about how they did with this concept and that concept. And that was an amazing experience. And it was amazing because let me tell you some of the people that were in the program with Nelson at that time. Alan Kay, and Alan Kay developed WordPerfect. But Alan Kay's father actually started K-Pro, and that's where Alan was working at that time. So if you ever had a K-Pro, that came out of the K Enterprises. John Warnock developed Adobe, Photoshop. That's part of his big business. And Grace Hopper. Do any of you remember the name Grace? She came and gave a seminar, and she, of course, developed COBOL. And these were people that were walking through Nelson's life every day and mine on occasion when I was invited to come to these seminars. So it truly was an amazing, and it really was a life-changing experience for me. Well, after that, life happens. So we buy the first of 5 airplanes, not all at once, but in sequence. We have 2 little boys. Nelson finishes his PhD and takes a faculty job at the University of Iowa in Iowa City, Iowa. And we were off. And I was pretty sure that I could have it all. I started my PhD. I'd started it at Utah, but two babies kind of interfered with getting as far as I want to. So I got involved deeply in it at University of Iowa. And I was absolutely certain that I could have a career, a big research career. I could have a family. I could have a successful marriage. And most importantly, I could be a soccer mom or a baseball mom for 2 little boys. And that's what I set out to do. I finished my PhD and my career begins. University of Iowa hired me, but not in math education. I had been doing really early kind of simple simulations. And they were looking for people because they were beginning to understand in the health field that simulations could be very valuable in many ways, not only in patient care, but also in testing and training students. So I was hired in the health center. And I figured a PhD was a license to learn. So that's exactly what I sought out to do. I realized in all of this, the fire that burned in my belly was curiosity. And so I designed for myself a postdoctoral training in pharmacology and physiology and psychology. And I found faculty members to be very receptive if they'd let me sit in on classes and I could meet in their seminars, and I worked hard, but it was an opportunity to pursue topics that were of importance and great interest to me. But you know, as a part of all that, if you want to be in research, you have to learn how to get funding. And I smile when I say that because I think about some of the early criticisms of my grant applications. Now, I was only going to small organizations for funding, and I was going to businesses. If I wanted to study some biomarker, I would go to some company and ask them to give me 3 dozen kits, and then we would learn how to study the whatever biomarkers we were looking at. But we got better and better, and I had great people that I was working with, wrote more and more grants. And you get pretty callous to the criticisms because there's probably no greater gift than really honest feedback on something that you're doing. And so writing grants. But this one, learning how to recruit subjects, because if you want to do big clinical trials, you have to recruit subjects. And I knew how to make presentations to medical people and dental people about the projects and justify the science and so on. And I'd learned enough science by this time that I could speak the lingo. But the issue of recruiting subjects was a bit more difficult. This was another pivotal moment for me because to recruit subjects, you really had to engage the staff in those practices because faculty was easy or the professionals were easy. And if we could get to the patients and tell them why this was a benefit to either the greater good or to them, we could do it. But it was the staff. And we had been particularly unsuccessful. We were studying stress and pain and the influence on the immune system, and then looking at health outcomes, particularly flu and colds, in the 6 to 8 weeks after they had had a stressful experience. And we were just not able to recruit subjects. And I'm sitting around with my smart students and we're brainstorming about this. And one of them says, you know, I've been thinking about this. The crabbiest animals in the jungle are the ones that are constipated. Let's try bran muffins. So we thought outside the box. We made bran muffins, took them in, and gave them to the staff, and we had incredible help after that. So it just goes to show, think outside the box and always think about bran muffins. We had a lot of success at Iowa, but I was recruited to come to the University of Florida. And I really ignored the first request to come because I didn't even know for sure where Iowa was or where Florida was, like, why would I want to go down there? And Nelson said, you really ought to go at least look at the job. So I did. And I came back and I said, the job is better than I thought it was. And there's some things about that university of 50,000 compared to University of Iowa, which was about 35,000, that looked very, very promising. So we did it. We moved to Florida. And it did indeed turn out to be the best career move I could make. The opportunities for cross-discipline work were just extraordinary. It's a huge university, so there's everything you really want to study. And if it's not here, it's at Florida State or it's around. And I had always learned that if you really need funding, you need to get closer to Bethesda, because that's where NIH is. Now, Florida's not a lot closer than Iowa City, but it is closer. And it's at least in the same time zone. So that turned out to be a very, very important part. The sheer size and the opportunities for collaboration were really important. So I was at the University of Florida. I was a full professor, of course, by that time, long before, and we had a lot of success in getting big grants. But I want to just talk about a couple of the awards that I am the most proud of based on my research career. The first one is something called the Gooden Award for Outstanding Research Papers. I was lucky enough to win that twice. My team and I were lucky enough. You never do these things on your own. And they were almost all centered on pain and stress. And I was in a dental setting, so I had lots and lots of root canal patients that I had access to. And dentists don't like for me to say this, but that's a pretty stressful experience for most people. So I got to have a little stress. I got to have a little pain. We could get plenty of blood if we wanted it, and we could look at changes in immune function and whether people got sick after that. So I'm very, very proud of that award. The second one is a slightly different. In 2008, I received the Award of Merit from the American College of Dentists. The American College of Dentists is a pretty special group. These individuals are elected to that position, and they're not only outstanding clinicians, but they are considered to be people of real integrity, and to be recognized by this group of people. And the exact citation was, for outstanding achievements that contribute to betterment of dentistry, the profession, and dental public health. And I was enormously pleased to go to San Antonio, receive that award. The last one I want to mention is the Research Foundation Award from University of Florida. This was after I'd been successful, our team. I say I, but it's never I, it's always we. Fran, come on in. We'd love to have you. And this was an award for a disparity center grant that I had received, our team had received, and we were looking at late effect outcomes of head and neck cancer treatment. And African-American men die at almost twice the rate of white men, and we were trying to understand what were some of the biological, psychological, sociological factors that were contributing to this outcome. And I got to study the area between Tallahassee and Jacksonville, that I-10 corridor. Had a chance to be in the communities with these individuals and understand more and more about how and why these disparities. The lack of healthcare was enormous, but there were many, many other deficiencies. So we had a chance to study that, and I was very, very thrilled, actually, to receive that award. In 2013, I didn't leave. I left the Duff compound. That house will never leave my heart. And we moved to Okamic. And here, I didn't know anyone here, but later on, I found Roxanne Blywise, and Arnie had been a colleague of mine and travels across Europe because he was part of sort of an immunology group that I had often hung out with. So it was an exciting time to come to Okamic as far as I was concerned. I didn't retire from UF, so I worked full-time for almost a year after we moved here. And after I retired from UF and lived here, then I had the opportunity to continue pursuing exciting ideas and pursue curiosity and baseball. I had a lot more time to get involved with the Gator Dugout Club and UF baseball, which is and now occupies an enormous amount of my interest and energy. I could continue to pursue the physical sciences and also the biological sciences because of our ILR and also because of the wonderful people I had a chance to hang out with. And I had enough background in science that I could really facilitate the citrus study, which is one of the things that I think we all have reason to be very proud that we participated in, and it was really a big team effort. But that's not all. There's family joy. And here in this picture is that grandson that lives only 6 minutes away from us, which, wow, grandma's in the room, how lucky are we? Our two sons, Connor over at the Shark Observatory, and also in the swamp with me. We got to take him to Alaska and jump into the icy cold waters. And here we all are celebrating his 18th birthday. So I ask you, was I right? I could have it all? Well, I sort of smoothed over some of the bumps in the road. But it has been an incredible adventure. So what do I take away from all of this reflection? Well, the first message is clear. All things come to she who waits if she worketh like hell while she waiteth. Not always the easy path So you design your own postdocs. So what? And if people believe you're committed, they often fall all over themselves to help you. Second part, care passionately, work diligently, and accept the results with grace. The last part of that is the hardest part. John Axe forwarded a video clip that had John Mather, who's the Nobel laureate and also the project director for the Webb telescope. And he was asking this, do you worry? And he says, oh no, he said, I make sure things are designed and tested and retested. And if I've done everything I can, then you accept the results with grace. So I figure if John Mather can say that, that's probably pretty good advice. And then, of course, the most important, when all else fails, try bran muffins. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Henry? Alice?
That was a pure delight, and I just want to ask you one question. Did you make these bran muffins? I wanted to know if your parents lived long enough to see you get your PhD and have that mass shift in your life.
Thanks for the question. Yes, they did. And I have to say something. I spent a lot of my life trying very hard to get my dad to say he was proud of me. And it wasn't until I was in my 50s that he finally said, I'm proud of you. And so never give up. Eventually, dads may say to you girls, I'm proud of you. Yes. My father lived to be 105 and my mother lived to be in her mid-90s. So they both did. And my dad said about my accomplishments, because he said, somebody said, why do you think she's that accomplished? And he said, I think it's because some man told her sometimes she couldn't do it.
So how did you train Nelson to follow you to Florida?
That's Mary Sue Coleman was the president of the University of Michigan, and she had been at University of Iowa before that. And Mary Sue gave some very sage advice to those of us that were in the career. She said, marry wisely. And I would be absolutely remiss to say that Nelson has been a fabulous, fabulous asset. But not only that, his career had definitely been the preeminent one. And we were at Iowa, and he had been an administrator. He had been an academic dean for education, you know, all those kinds of things. But I think he was getting kind of tired of it. And in a way, I think he kind of looked at this and said, Florida, why not? And so he said, let's go. And he began his own business. He stayed at the university for a little tiny time, but then he began his own business. And I think he would say, don't want to put my words in his mouth, that was the best gig of his life when he started his own business. So it worked. He was a business consultant. He did executive coaches for CEOs, executive coaching for CEOs.
Henry, tell us a little bit about your flying adventures.
Oh, yes. I mentioned we owned 5 airplanes. The first major fight we had in our marriage was whether we were going to pay the rent or pay for his flying lessons. 5,000 hours later, and 5 airplanes, you can tell what won. We did. We started out in Salt Lake City with an older V-tail, and we talked about this. It was a B model for those that you know anything about beach bonanzas. We sold that when we left Salt Lake and moved to Iowa City. We bought a C model, which is still the V-tail. And we were in partnership with other people with an S model and so on. We traveled all over the world. But I frankly found it too restricting not to own our own airplane. So I was the banker and I said, get rid of these partners. And we bought our own airplane. And so for most of our married life, when we had an airplane, we had our own airplane and we flew everywhere from Seattle to San Diego to the Bahamas, up and down the coast. In fact, invite us to a wedding in Madison, Wisconsin, no matter where we lived, we'd drop everything and go. It gave us a very distorted view of how far it is from one place to another now that we don't have an airplane. But it was fabulous, and we were true partners in that.
You didn't tell Henrietta what NFS stands for.
Oh, sorry. National Science Foundation. National Science Foundation. One other cute little thing I just want to say in terms of acronyms like that is when I was working on my PhD and I'd have a babysitter come in to take care of our two little boys, the littlest one kept asking the babysitter, what's a BHD? Do you have a BHD? And she finally said, what is a BHD? I don't have one. And he said, I don't know what it is either, but when Mom gets hers, we're going on vacation. And we did. Yeah.
Here you go.
The baseball team. You mean the Gator baseball team? Yep. Well, I just had a wonderful conversation with one of the assistant coaches, and they are cautiously optimistic that we are going to be able to field a really great team. There's some people coming back. Colby Halter is the MVP in the Cape Cod League this year, and Brandon Sprode is back, and he is a very good pitcher. And they think they have recruited some others. And some of those shaky bullpen pitchers have really had a chance to work this summer, and they think that they're going to be ready to come in and be the mid-inning person and then the closer. We need a closer. So I'm excited about baseball.
Tell us how you got involved with your beautiful orchids.
Well, I didn't even mention that, did I? Nelson's mother lived in Hawaii, and it was his biological mother, and he had not seen her from the time he was 12 until we were married. And she sent tickets, and we flew to Hawaii. But that was only to add on to my interest in orchids. Did anybody ever know the movie Alice Blue Gown? My mother's name was Alice, and that was a movie that she liked. And it's a story about a young girl who falls in love with her teacher, and she's not allowed to go with her teacher. But her father gives her a corsage and takes her to the prom. And it's orchids this long. And I was so captured by orchids this long, and that I got interested in raising orchids. And so I, from that time on, with my mother-in-law's help in Hawaii, had orchids and pursued it and still love them. They're one of those few plants that you never know by looking at that ugly foliage what kind of a beautiful flower it's going to produce. I say it's like people. You can't always tell by looking at them what's inside there.
Diane, I saw you on Zoom. Did you have a comment? I wasn't sure.
I did. I'll start the video too, so you can see me here in North Carolina.
Hi, Diane.
Hi. Yeah, I was interested in the orchids, but you've just answered the question. You were so instrumental in the citrus study. I know my nose still worries about getting swabbed once a week.
Yeah.
But would you tell us a little bit more of how you got involved in it and your interpretation of what we
Yeah.
did and what the results are
Yeah.
at this point? Thanks, Henry.
Thank you. The CDC had contacted OCAMIC way months before it began and said, would you like to have free testing for all of your residents? And Marie had come to me at that time and had said, this sounds like something really great. And I agreed, because you remember, testing was expensive and very difficult to obtain. And so she and I had talked a lot about my research when I was at UF, and she was very, very well aware that I was a pretty heavily funded researcher and knew a good deal about that. And she figured, well, if she knows how to do this, anybody can do it. Well, when the protocols came, they were pretty complicated. And she looked at it and said, I don't have any idea how to do this. And she contacted me and said, do you think we can do this? And I said, remember me, aim high, sure we can do this. And that's how we got involved. And we were, because of you all and your understanding of the importance of research in sort of the greater good, we were able to recruit far more than anybody else. Many of the original sites dropped out because they didn't understand that. Their residents didn't understand it, and they were not willing to do all that nasal swab stuff. And that's how we kept going. And as far as what the results are, I spoke with CDC about 2 weeks ago about this, and they're absolutely honest in the fact that we shut it down in December and then we all got sick right after Christmas. He said, well, obviously we were a little bubble to protect you all. We simply didn't get sick enough. And we're an awfully healthy group of individuals. And I think that was part of the problem. We learned a lot about compliance, and I think we learned a great deal about that if people understand how this can benefit other people, they're willing to do most anything. So I think those are the main messages that came out of that. I don't think there's an awful lot of basic science that came out because we just didn't get sick. Maybe that's because you were extra vigilant, and maybe after the citrus study and after we weren't doing those weekly swabs, we let up a little bit. There's a lot of different interpretations, but I believe that's probably the take-home message, Diane.
Great. Thank you, Henry.
You're welcome. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but you keep using
I'm
these
sorry.
initials, and you didn't explain what the CDC is.
Okay. Center for Disease Control. And that is the main public health arm of the US government. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been great fun. Thank you. Thank you.